The Table and the Chair by Edward Lear. Said the table to the chair, "You can hardly be aware how I suffer from the heat and from shivers on my feet. If we took a little walk, we might have a little talk. Pray let us take the air," said the table to the chair. Said the chair unto the table, "Now you know we are not able. How foolish you talk. When you know we cannot walk," said the table with a sigh, "it can do no harm to try. I've as many legs as you. Why can't we walk on two?" So they both went slowly down and walked about the town, with a cheerful bumpy sound as they toddled round and round, and everybody cried, as they hasted to their side, "See, a table and a chair have come out to take the air." But in going down an alley to a castle in a valley, they completely lost their way and wandered all the day, till, to see them safely back, they paid a duck quack and a beetle and a mouse, who took them to their house. When they whispered to each other, "Oh, delightful little brother, what a lovely walk we've taken. Let us dine on beans and bacon." So the ducky and the little browny mouse and the beetle dined and danced upon their heads till they toddled to their beds.
There is a young lady whose nose, by Edward Lear. There is a young lady whose nose continually prospers and grows. When it grew out of sight, she exclaimed in affright, "Oh, farewell to the end of my nose."
98. There was a young girl of Majorca. There was a young girl of Majorca whose aunt was a very fast walker. She walked 70 miles and leaped 15 stiles, which astonished that girl of Majorca.
There was a young lady in blue, by Edward Lear. There was a young lady in blue who said, "Is it you, is it you?" And we said, "Yes, it is." She replied only, "Whiz," that ungracious young lady in blue. There was a young lady in white, by Edward Lear. There was a young lady in white who looked out at the depths of the night. But the bird of the air filled her hair with despair and oppressed that young lady in white.
39. There was a young lady of Bute. There was a young lady of Bute who played on a silver-gilt flute. She played several tricks to her uncle's white pigs, that amusing young lady of Bute. 91. There was an old person of Cheadle. There was an old person of Cheadle who was put in the stocks by the beadle, for stealing some pigs, some coats, and some wigs. That horrible person of Cheadle. 103. There was a young lady of Clare. There was a young lady of Clare who was sadly pursued by a bear. When she found she was tired, she abruptly expired, that unfortunate lady of Clare.
There was a young lady of Corsica, by Edward Lear. There was a young lady of Corsica who purchased a little brown saucy girl, which she fed upon ham and hot raspberry jam, that expensive young lady of Corsica.
25. There was a young lady of Dorking. There was a young lady of Dorking who bought a large bonnet for walking, but its colour and size so bedazzled her eyes that she very soon went back to Dorking.
There was a young lady of Firle, by Edward Lear. There was a young lady of Firle whose hair was addicted to curl. It curled up a tree and all over the sea, that expensive young lady of Firle. There was a young lady of Greenwich, by Edward Lear. There was a young lady of Greenwich whose garments were bordered with spinach, but a large spotty calf bit her shawl quite in half, which alarmed that young lady of Greenwich.
70. There was a young lady of Hull. There was a young lady of Hull who was chased by a violent bull, but she seized on a spade and called out, "Who's afraid?" which distracted that violent bull. 51. There was a young lady of Lucca. There was a young lady of Lucca whose lovers completely forsook her. She ran up a tree and said "Fiddly-dee," which embarrassed the people of Lucca. 30. There was a young lady of Norway. There was a young lady of Norway who casually sat in a doorway. When the door squeezed her flat, she exclaimed, "What a wet!" This courageous young lady of Norway. 106. There was a young lady of Parma. There was a young lady of Parma whose conduct grew calmer and calmer. When I said, "Are you dumb?" she merrily said, that provoking young lady of Parma. 16. There was a young lady of Portugal. There was a young lady of Portugal whose ideas were excessively nauseous. She climbed up a tree to examine the sea, but declared she would never leave Portugal. 88. There was a young lady of Russia. There was a young lady of Russia who screamed so that no one could hush her. Her screams were extreme. No one heard such a scream as was screamed by that lady of Russia. 2. There was a young lady of Ryde. There was a young lady of Ryde whose shoestrings were seldom untied. She purchased some clocks and some small spotted dogs, and frequently walked about Ryde. 97. There was a young lady of Sweden. There was a young lady of Sweden who went by the slow train to Ryde, and we cried, "Ryde station!" She made no observation, but thought she should go back to Sweden. 85. There was a young lady of Troy. There was a young lady of Troy whom several large flies did annoy. Some she killed with a thump, some she drowned at the pump, and some she took with her to Troy. 76. There was a young lady of Tyre. There was a young lady of Tyre who swept without cords of a lyre. At the sound of each sweep she enraptured the deep and enchanted the city of Tyre. 90. There was a young lady of Wales. There was a young lady of Wales who caught a large fish without scales. And she lifted her hook, she exclaimed, "On you look, that aesthetic young lady of Wales." 92. There was a young lady of Welling. There was a young lady of Welling whose praise all the world was a telling. She played on a harp and caught several carp, that accomplished young lady of Welling. 5. There was a young lady whose bonnet. There was a young lady whose bonnet came untied when the bird sat upon it. But she said, "I don't care, all the birds in the air are welcome to sit on my bonnet." 12. There was a young lady whose chin. There was a young lady whose chin resembled the point of a pen. So she had it made sharp, and purchased a harp, and played several tunes with the chin. 29. There was a young lady whose eyes. There was a young lady whose eyes were unique as to color and size, and she opened them wide. People all turned aside and started away in surprise. 40. There was a young lady whose nose. There was a young lady whose nose was so long that it reaches to her toes. So she hired an old lady whose conduct was steady to carry what a wonderful nose.
There was a young person in green by Edward Lear. There was a young person in green who seldom was fit to be seen. She wore a long shawl over bonnet and all, which enveloped the person in green. There was a young person in pink by Edward Lear. There was a young person in pink who called out for something to drink, but they said, "Oh, my daughter, there's nothing but water," which vexed that young person in pink. There was a young person in red by Edward Lear. There was a young person in red who carefully covered her head with a bonnet of leather and 3 lines of heather, besides some long ribbons of red. There was a young person of Tyre by Edward Lear. There was a young person of Tyre whose head was remarkably square. On the top, in fine weather, she wore a gold feather, which dazzled the people of Tyre. There was a young person of Bantry by Edward Lear. There was a young person of Bantry who frequently slept in the pantry. When disturbed by the mice, she appeased them with rice. The judicious young person of Bantry.
21. There was a young person of Crete. There was a young person of Crete whose toilet was far from complete. She dressed in a sack spickle-speckled with black, that omnivorous person of Crete.
There was a young man of Janina by Edward Lear. There was a young man of Janina whose uncle was always fanning her. When he fanned off her hair, she smiled sweetly and said, "You propitious old person of Janina."
6. There was a young person of Smyrna. There was a young person of Smyrna whose grandmother threatened to burn her, but she seized on the cat and said, "Granny, burn that, you uncrucious old woman of Smyrna."
There was a young person whose history by Edward Lear. There was a young person whose history was always considered a mystery. She sat in a ditch, although no one knew which, and composed a small treatise on history.
9. There was an old lady of Chertsey. There was an old lady of Chertsey who made a remarkable curtsy. She twirled round and round till she sank underground, which distressed all the people of Chertsey.
There was an old lady of France by Edward Lear. There was an old lady of France, who taught little ducklings to dance. When she said, "Tick-a-tack," they only said, "Quack," which grieved that old lady of France.
100. There was an old lady of Prague. There was an old lady of Prague whose language was Hobblewark. And they said, "Are we scabs?" She answered, "Perhaps, that oracle lady of Prague."
There was an old lady of Winchelsea by Edward Lear. There was an old lady of Winchelsea who said, "If your needle or pin shall see on the floor of my room, sweep it up with a broom." That's the exhaustive old lady of Winchelsea.
55. There was an old lady whose folly. There was an old lady whose folly inducted her to sit in a holy, whereupon by a throne, her dress being torn, she quickly became melancholy. 102. There was an old man at a casement. There was an old man at a casement who held up his hands in amazement. When they said, "Sir, you'll fall," he replied, "Not at all, but incipient old man at a casement."
There was an old man at a junction by Edward Lear. There was an old man at a junction whose feelings were wrung with compunction. When we said, "The train's gone," he exclaimed, "How forlorn!" But he remained on the rails of the junction. There was an old man at a station by Edward Lear. There was an old man at a station who made a promiscuous oration, but they said, "Take some snuff, you've talked quite enough, you afflicting old man at the station." There was an old man in the barge by Edward Lear. There was an old man in the barge whose nose was exceedingly large. But in fishing by night it supported a light, which helped that old man in the barge.
15. There was an old man in a boat. There was an old man in a boat who said, "I'm afloat, I'm afloat." And they said, "No, you ain't." He was ready to faint, but unhappy old man in a boat.
There was an old man in the garden by Edward Lear. There was an old man in the garden who always begged everyone's pardon. When they asked him, "What for?" he replied, "You're a bore, and I trust you'll go out of my garden." There was an old man in the marsh by Edward Lear. There was an old man in the marsh whose manners were futile and harsh. He sat on a log and sang songs to a frog, that intrusive old man in the marsh.
68. There was an old man in a pew. There was an old man in a pew whose waistcoat was spotted with blue, but he tore it in pieces to give to his nieces, a cheerful old man in a pew.
There was an old man in a tree by Edward Lear. There was an old man in a tree whose whiskers were lovely to see. But the birds of the air plucked them perfectly bare to make themselves nests in the tree.
108. There was an old man of Aosta. There was an old man of Aosta who possessed a large cow, but he lost her. But I said, "Don't you see? She was rushed up a tree, you inwardous old man of Aosta." 41. There was an old man of Apulia. There was an old man of Apulia whose conduct was very peculiar. He fed 20 sons upon nothing but buns, that whimsical man of Apulia. 81. There was an old person of Bangor. There was an old person of Bangor whose face was distorted with anger. He tore off his boots and subsides on roots, that irascible person of Bangor.
There was an old man of Blackheath by Edward Lear. There was an old man of Blackheath whose head was adorned with a wreath of lobsters and spice, pickled onions and mice, that uncommon old man of Blackheath.
52. There was an old man of Bohemia. There was an old man of Bohemia whose daughter was christened Euphemia. But one day, to his credit, she married a thief, which grieved that old man of Bohemia.
There was an old man of Boulak by Edward Lear. There was an old man of Boulak who sat on a crocodile's back. But they said, "Towards the night he may probably bite, which might vex you, old man of Boulak."
67. There was an old man of Calcutta. There was an old man of Calcutta who per pulti ate bread and butter, till a great bit of muffin on which he was stuffing shook that horrid old man of Calcutta. 54. There was an old man of Cape Horn. There was an old man of Cape Horn who wished he had never been born. So he sat on a chair till he died of despair, the dolorous man of Cape Horn. 66. There was an old man of Coblenz. There was an old man of Coblenz, the length of whose legs was immense. He went with one pranks from Turkey to France, but surprising old man of Coblenz. 24. There was an old man of Columbia. There was an old man of Columbia who was thirsty and called out for some beer, but they brought it quite hot in a small copper pot, which disgusted that man of Columbia. 56. There was an old man of Corfu. There was an old man of Corfu who never knew what he should do. So he rushed up and down till the sun made him brown, that bewildered old man of Corfu.
There was an old man of Deeside by Edward Lear. There was an old man of Deeside whose head was exceedingly white, but he said, "Do not fail, if it happened to hail to come under my head at Deeside." There was an old man of Dumblane by Edward Lear. There was an old man of Dumblane who greatly resembled a crane. But they said, "Is it wrong, since your legs are so long, to request you won't stay in Dumblane?" There was an old man of Dumbree by Edward Lear. There was an old man of Dumbree who taught little owls to drink tea. For he said, "To eat mice is not proper or nice, but amiable man of Dumbree."
63. There was an old man of Dundee. There was an old man of Dundee who frequented the top of a tree. When disturbed by the crows, he abruptly arose and exclaimed, "I'll return to Dundee."
There was an old man of Dunluce by Edward Lear. There was an old man of Dunluce who went out to sea on a goose. When he'd gone out a mile, he observed with a smile, "It's time to return to Dunluce." There was an old man of Dunrose by Edward Lear. There was an old man of Dunrose. A parrot seized hold of his nose. When he grew melancholy, they said, "His name's Polly," which soothed the old man of Dunrose.
75. There was an old person of Dutton. There was an old person of Dutton whose head was as small as a button. So to make it look big, he purchased a wig and rapidly rushed about Dutton.
There was an old man of Elhams by Edward Lear. There was an old man of Elhams who lived upon nothing but crumbs, which he picked off the ground with the other birds around, in the roads and the lanes of Elhams. There was an old man of Hong Kong by Edward Lear. There was an old man of Hong Kong who never did anything wrong. He lay on his back with his head in a sack, the innocuous old man of Hong Kong.
74. There was an old man of Jamaica. There was an old man of Jamaica who suddenly married a Quaker, but she cried out, "Alack, I've married a black," which distressed that old man of Jamaica. 79. There was an old man of Kamschatka. There was an old man of Kamschatka who possessed a remarkable fat cow. His gait and his waddle were held as a model to all the fat dogs in Kamschatka. 30. There was an old man of Kilkenny. There was an old man of Kilkenny who never had more than a penny. He spent all that money and onions and honey for the wayward old man of Kilkenny. 72. There was an old man of Leghorn. There was an old man of Leghorn, the smallest that ever was born, but quickly stepped up he was once be a puppy, who devoured that old man of Leghorn. 18. There was an old man of Madras. There was an old man of Madras, rode on a cream-colored ass, but the length of its ears so promoted his fears, that it killed that old man of Madras. 34. There was an old man of Marseille. There was an old man of Marseille whose daughters wore bottle-green wails. They caught several fish which they put in a dish and sent to their pa at Marseilles. 50. There was an old man of Melrose. There was an old man of Melrose who walked on the tips of his toes, but they said, "It ain't pleasant to see you at present, you stupid old man of Melrose."
There was an old man of Messina by Edward Lear. There was an old man of Messina whose daughter was named Obsibina. She wore a small wig and rode out on a pig, to the perfect delight of Messina.
17. There was an old man of Moldavia. There was an old man of Moldavia who had the most curious behavior, for while he was able, he slept on a table, that funny old man of Moldavia. 46. There was an old man of Neapol. There was an old man of Neapol whose horse had a terrible fall, but woe split quite in two with some very strong glue, where mended that man of Neapol. 49. There was an old man of Peru. There was an old man of Peru who watched his wife making a stew, but once by mistake in the stove she did bake that unfortunate man of Peru.
There was an old man of Port Grigor by Edward Lear. There was an old man of Port Grigor whose actions were noted for vigour. He stood on his head till his waistcoat turned red, the dialectic old man of Port Grigor.
37. There was an old man of Quebec. There was an old man of Quebec, a beetle ran over his neck, but he cried, "With a needle I'll slay you, O beetle!" But angry old man of Quebec.
There was an old man of Spithead by Edward Lear. There was an old man of Spithead, opened the window and said, Feel jumble, feel rumble, come tumble, the doubtful old man of Spithead.
47. There was an old man of Abruzzi. There was an old man of Abruzzi, so blind that he couldn't his foot see. And he said, "What's your toe?" He replied, "Is it so?" That doubtful old man of Abruzzi. 99. There was an old man of a Cape. There was an old man of a Cape who possessed a large Barbary ape, till the ape one dark night set the house all alight, which burned that old man of a Cape. 80. There was an old man of the coast. There was an old man of the coast who placidly sat on the post, but when it was cold he relinquished his hold, and called for some hot butter toast.
There was an old man of a dark by Edward Lear. There was an old man of a dark who purchased 6 barrels of garlic, for he said, I'd sit still and will roll them downhill for the fish in the depths of a dark.
62. There was an old man of a Dee. There was an old man of a Dee who was sadly annoyed by a flea, and he said, I will scratch it. I gave him a hatchet, which grieved that old man of a Dee. 78. There was an old man of the East. There was an old man of the East who gave all his children a feast, but they all ate so much and their conduct was such that it killed that old man of the East. 73. There was an old man of the Hague. There was an old man of the Hague whose ideas were excessively vague. He built a balloon to examine the moon, the deluded old man of the Hague. 22. There was an old man of the Isles. There was an old man of the Isles whose face was paraded with smiles. He sang Higdum-diddle-lee and played on the fiddle, that eminent man of the Isles. 58. There was an old man of a Nile. There was an old man of a Nile who sharpened his nails with a file, till he cut off his thumbs and said calmly, This comes of sharpening one's nails with a file. 44. There was an old man of the North. There was an old man of the North who fell into a basin of broth, but the laudable cook fished him out with a hook, which saved that old man of the North. 57. There was an old man of the South. There was an old man of the South who had an immorate mouth, but in swallowing a dish that was quite full of fish, he was choked, that old man of the South. 27. There was an old man of the West. There was an old man of the West who wore a pale plum-colored vest, and I said, Does it fit? He replied, Not a bit, but uneasy old man of the West. 83. There was an old man of the West. There was an old man of the West who never could get any rest, so they set him to spin on his nose and his chin, which cured that old man of the West. 28. There was an old man of a Wrekin. There was an old man of a Wrekin whose shoes made a horrible cracking. But I said, Tell us whether your shoes are of leather, or of what, you old man of a Wrekin.
There was an old man of Thermopylae by Edward Lear. There was an old man of Firle who never did anything properly, but they said, "If you choose to boil eggs in your shoes, you shall never remain in Firle." There was an old man of 3 brigades by Edward Lear. There was an old man of 3 brigades whose mind was distracted by midges. He sate on a wheel, eating an underdone wheel, which relieved that old man of 3 bridges. There was an old man of Toulouse by Edward Lear. There was an old man of Toulouse who purchased a new pair of shoes. When they asked, "Are they pleasant?" he said, "Not at present." The turbid old man of Toulouse.
53. There was an old man of Vesuvius. There was an old man of Vesuvius who studied the works of Vitruvius, and the flames burned his book, to drinking it took, but morbid old man of Vesuvius. 31. There was an old man of Vienna. There was an old man of Vienna who lived upon tincture of senna, but the wet did not agree. He took camoleon tea, that nasty old man of Vienna.
There was an old man of West Dumpet by Edward Lear. There was an old man of West Dumpet who possessed a large nose like a trumpet. When he blew it aloud, it astonished the crowd, and was heard through the whole of West Dumpet.
71. There was an old man of Whitehaven. There was an old man of Whitehaven who danced a cradle with a raven, but he said, "It's absurd to encourage this bird." So he smashed that old man of Whitehaven. 4. There was an old man on a hill. There was an old man on a hill who seldom, if ever, stood still. He ran up and down in his grandmother's gown, which adorned that old man on a hill. 65. There was an old man on some rocks. There was an old man on some rocks who shut his wife up in a box. When she said, "Let me out," he exclaimed, "Without doubt you will pass all life in that box."
There was an old man on the border by Edward Lear. There was an old man on the border who lived in the utmost disorder. He danced with a cat and made tea in his hat, which vexed all the folks on the border. There was an old man on the Humber by Edward Lear. There was an old man on the Humber who dined on a cake of burnt wumber. When he said, "It's enough," they only said, "Stuff." The amazing old man on the Humber.
105. There was an old person on whose nose. There was an old person on whose nose most birds of the air could repose, but they all flew away at the closing of day, which relived that old man and his nose. 69. There was an old man who said, "How?" There was an old man who said, "How should I flee with that horrible cow? I will sit on the stile and continue to smile, which may soften the heart of that cow." 77. There was an old man who said, "Hush." There was an old man who said, "Hush, I perceived a young bird in this bush." And I said, "Is it small?" He replied, "Not at all. It is 4 times as big as the bush." 89. There was an old man who said, "Well." There was an old man who said, "Well, will nobody answer the spell? I've pulled day and night, and my hair has grown white, but nobody answers the spell."
There was an old man who screamed out by Edward Lear. There was an old man who screamed out whenever they knocked him about. So they took off his boots and fed him with fruits and continued to knock him about.
26. There was an old man who supposed. There was an old man who supposed that his street door was partially closed, but some very large rats ate his coats and his hats, while that feudal old gentleman dust.
There was an old man who when little fell casually into a kettle by Edward Lear. There was an old man who when little fell casually into a kettle, but growing too stout, he could never get out, so he passed all his life in that kettle. There was an old man whose despair by Edward Lear. There was an old man whose despair induced him to purchase a hare. On one fine day he rode wholly away, which partly assuaged his despair. There was an old man whose remorse by Edward Lear. There was an old man whose remorse induced him to drink caper sauce. For they said, if mixed up with some cold claret cup, it will certainly soothe your remorse.
The Book of Nonsense by Edward Lear. 1. There was an old man with a beard. There was an old man with a beard who said, "It is just as I fear. 2 owls and a hen, 4 larks and a wren have all built their nests in my beard." 82. There was an old man with a beard. There was an old man with a beard who sat on a horse when he reared. But I said, "Never mind, you will fall off behind, you propitious old man with a beard." 11. There was an old man with a flute. There was an old man with a flute, a serpent ran into his boot. But he played day and night, till the sparrow took flight, and avoided that man with a flute. 8. There was an old man with a gong. There was an old man with a gong, who bumped at it all the day long. But I called out, "Oh law, you're a horrid old bore." So I smashed that old man with a gong. 3. There was an old man with a nose. There was an old man with a nose who said, "If you choose to suppose that my nose is too long, you are certainly wrong. That remarkable man with a nose." 42. There was an old man with a poker. There was an old man with a poker who painted his face with red ochre. And I said, "You are a guy." He made no reply, but knocked them all down with his poker. 95. There was an old man with an owl. There was an old man with an owl who continued to bother and howl. He sat on a rail and imbibed a bitter ale, which refreshed that old man and his owl. 96. There was an old person from Kretna. There was an old person of Kretna who rushed down the crater of Etna. And they said, "Is it hot?" He replied, "No, it's not, that mendacious old person of Kretna."
There was an old person in black by Edward Lear. There was an old person in black. A grasshopper jumped on his back. When it chirped in his ear, he was smitten with fear. That helpless old person in black. There was an old person in grey by Edward Lear. There was an old person in grey, whose feelings were tinged with dismay. She purchased 2 parrots and fed them with carrots, which pleased that old person in grey.
84. There was an old person of Ennerley. There was an old person of Ennerley whose conduct was strange and unmannerly. He rushed down the strand with a pick in each hand, but returned in the evening to Ennerley.
There was an old person of Bar by Edward Lear. There was an old person of Bar who passed all her life in a jar, which he painted pea green to appear more serene, that blessed old person of Bar. There was an old person of Barnes by Edward Lear. There was an old person of Barnes whose garments were covered with darns. But they said, "Without doubt you will soon wear them out, you luminous person of Barnes."
36. There was an old person of Basing. There was an old person of Basing whose presence of mind was amazing. He purchased a steed which he rode at full speed and escaped from the people of Basing. 86. There was an old person of Berlin. There was an old person of Berlin whose form was uncommonly thin, till he once, by mistake, was mixed up in a cake so baked with Old Man of Berlin.
There was an old person of Blyth by Edward Lear. There was an old person of Blyth who got up his meat with a skiff. When they said, "Well, I never," he cried, "skiffs forever." That lively old person of Blyth. There was an old person of Bray by Edward Lear. There was an old person of Bray who sang through the whole of the day to his ducks and his pigs, whom he fed upon figs. That valuable person of Bray. There was an old person of Bree by Edward Lear. There was an old person of Bree who frequented the depths of the sea. She nursed the small fishes and washed all the dishes, and swam back again into Bree. There was an old person of Breek by Edward Lear. There was an old person of Breek who purchased no end of a week, so that only his nose and the end of his toes could be seen when he walked about Breek. There was an old person of Brill by Edward Lear. There was an old person of Brill who purchased a shirt with a frill. But they said, "Don't you wish you mayn't look like a fish, you obsequious old person of Brill?" There was an old person of Bromley by Edward Lear. There was an old person of Bromley whose ways were not cheerful or comely. He sat in the dust, eating spiders and crust, that unpleasing old person of Bromley.
23. There was an old person of Bute. There was an old person of Bute, whose conduct grew ruder and ruder, till at last with a hammer I silenced his clamour, by smashing that person of Bute.
There was an old person of Bute by Edward Lear. There was an old person of Bute, whose deportment was vicious and crude. He wore a large ruff of pale straw-coloured stuff, which perplexed all the people of Bute.
107. There was an old person of Burton. There was an old person of Burton, whose answers were very uncertain. When they said, "How do you do?" he replied, "Who are you?" That distressing old person of Burton. 35. There was an old person of Cadets. There was an old person of Cadets who was always polite to the ladies, but in handing his daughter he fell into the water, which drowned that old person of Cadets.
There was an old person of Cannes by Edward Lear. There was an old person of Cannes who purchased 3 fowls and a fan. Those she placed on a stool, and to make them feel cool, she constantly fanned them at Cannes. There was an old person of Cassel by Edward Lear. There was an old person of Cassel whose nose finished off in a tassel, but they called him, "Oh well, don't it look like a bell?" which perplexed the old person of Cassel.
94. There was an old person of Chester. There was an old person of Chester, whom several small children did pester. They threw some large stones, which broke most of his bones. It is pleased with old person of Chester. 7. There was an old person of Chile. There was an old person of Chile, whose conduct was painful and silly. He sat on the stairs, eating apples and pears, an imprudent old person of Chile.
There was an old person of China by Edward Lear. There was an old person of China whose daughters were Gisca and Dinah, Amelia and Fluffy, Olivia and Chaffy, and all of them settled in China.
60. There was an old person of Cromer. There was an old person of Cromer who stood on one leg to read Homer. When he found he grew stiff, he jumped over the cliff, which concluded the person of Cromer.
There was an old person of Crowle by Edward Lear. There was an old person of Crowle who lived in the nest of an owl. When they screamed in the nest, he screamed out with the rest, a depressing old person of Crowle. There was an old person of Deal by Edward Lear. There was an old person of Deal who in walking used only his heel. When they said, "Tell us why," he made no reply, that mysterious old person of Deal. There was an old person of Dean by Edward Lear. There was an old person of Dean who dined on 1 pea and 1 bean. For he said, "More than that would make me too fat," that cautious old person of Dean.
33. There was an old person of Dover. There was an old person of Dover who rushed through a field of blue clover. But some very large bees stung his nose and his knees, so he very soon went back to Dover.
There was an old person of Down by Edward Lear. There was an old person of Down whose face was adorned with a frown. When he opened the door, for 1 minute or more, he alarmed all the people of Down. There was an old person of Dundalk by Edward Lear. There was an old person of Dundalk who tried to teach fishes to walk. When they tumbled down dead, he grew very and said, "I'd better go back to Dundalk." There was an old person of Ealing by Edward Lear. There was an old person of Ealing who was wholly devoid of good feeling. He drove a small gig with 3 owls and a pig, which distressed all the people of Ealing.
104. There was an old person of Ems. There was an old person of Ems who casually fell in the Thames, and when he was found, they said he was drowned, that unlucky old person of Ems. 109. There was an old person of Ewell. There was an old person of Ewell who chiefly subsisted on cruel, but to make it more nice, he inserted some mice, which refreshed that old person of Ewell.
There was an old person of Fife by Edward Lear. There was an old person of Fife who was greatly disgusted with life. By singing a ballad and fed him on salad which cured that old person of Fife. There was an old person of Firle by Edward Lear. There was an old person of Firle of whom his acquaintance spoke highly. He danced perfectly well to the sound of a bell, and delighted the people of Firle. There was an old person of Florence by Edward Lear. There was an old person of Florence who held mutton chops in abhorrence. He purchased a bustard and freed them in mustard which choked that old person of Florence. There was an old person of Greenwich by Edward Lear. There was an old person of Greenwich whose manners were scrupulous and strange. He said to Saint Blub in a waterproof tub, that aquatic old person of Greenwich. There was an old person of Hove by Edward Lear. There was an old person of Hove who frequented the depths of a grove, where he studied his books with the wrens and the rooks, the tranquil old person of Hove.
20. There was an old person of Hurst. There was an old person of Hurst who drank when he was not athirst. When they said, "You'll grow fatter," he answered, "What matter?" A globular person of Hurst.
There was an old person of Ryde by Edward Lear. There was an old person of Ryde who walked by the shore with his bride, till a crab, who came near, filled their bosoms with fear, and they said, "Would we've never left Ryde." There was an old person of Ibrahim by Edward Lear. There was an old person of Ibrahim who suddenly threatened to scream, but they said, "If you do, we will thumb you quite blue, you disgusting old man of Ibrahim." There was an old person of Ilkley by Edward Lear. There was an old person of Ilkley who could not abide to ride quickly. He rode to Carnac on a tortoise's back, that moony old person of Ilkley.
14. There was an old person of Ischia. There was an old person of Ischia whose conduct grew frisker and friskier. He danced hornpipes and jigs and ate thousands of figs, that lively old person of Ischia.
There was an old person of Jot by Edward Lear. There was an old person of Jot whose ways were perplexing and odd. She purchased a whistle and sate on a thistle, and squeaked to the people of Jot.
19. There was an old person of Leeds. There was an old person of Leeds whose head was infested with beets. She sat on a stool and ate gooseberry fool, which agreed with the person of Leeds.
There was an old person of Loo by Edward Lear. There was an old person of Loo who said, "What on earth shall I do?" When they said, "Go away," she continued to stay with the vexatious old person of Loo. There was an old person of Minetti by Edward Lear. There was an old person of Minetti who purchased 590 large apples and pears, which he threw unawares at the heads of the people of Minetti.
45. There was an old person of Mold. There was an old person of Mold who shrank from sensations of cold, so he purchased some muffs, some thews, and some fluffs, and wrapped himself up from the cold.
There was an old person of Newry by Edward Lear. There was an old person of Newry whose manners were tinctured with fury. He tore all the rugs and broke all the jugs, within 20 miles distance of Newry. There was an old person of Nice by Edward Lear. There was an old person of Nice whose associates were usually geese. They walked out together in all sorts of weather, that affable person of Nice. There was an old person of Pett by Edward Lear. There was an old person of Pett who was partly consumed by regret. He sat in a cart and ate cold apple tart, which relieved that old person of Pett.
38. There was an old person of Firle, whose conduct was dubious and wily. He rushed up a palm when the weather was calm, and observed all the ruins of Firle.
There was an old person of Pinner by Edward Lear. There was an old person of Pinner, as thin as a lath, if not thinner. They dressed him in white and rode him up tight, that elastic old person of Pinner. There was an old person of Pisa by Edward Lear. There was an old person of Pisa whose daughters did nothing to please her. She dressed them in grey and banged them all day on the walls of the city of Pisa.
43. There was an old person of Prague. There was an old person of Prague who was suddenly seized with a plague. But I gave him some butter, which caused him to mutter, and cured that old person of Prague.
There was an old person of Putney by Edward Lear. There was an old person of Putney, whose food was roast spiders and chutney, which he took with his tea, within sight of a sea, a romantic old person of Putney.
59. There was an old person of Reims. There was an old person of Reims who was troubled with horrible dreams. So, to keep him awake, they fed him on cake, which amused that old person of Reims. 48. There was an old person of Rhodes. There was an old person of Rhodes who strongly objected to toads. He played several cousins to catch them by dozens. That futile old person of Rhodes.
There was an old person of Rimini by Edward Lear. There was an old person of Rimini who said, "Gracious goodness, oh gimminy." When they said, "Please be still," she ran down a hill and was never more heard of at Rimini. There was an old person of Rye by Edward Lear. There was an old person of Rye who went up to town on a fly. But they said, "If you caw, you're safe to fall off, you abstemious old person of Rye." There was an old person of Sark by Edward Lear. There was an old person of Sark who made an unpleasant remark. But they said, "Don't you see what a brute you must be, you obnoxious old person of Sark?" There was an old person of Sestri by Edward Lear. There was an old person of Sestri who sat himself down in the vestry. When they said, "You're wrong," he merely said, "Wrong." That repulsive old person of Sestri. There was an old person of Sheen by Edward Lear. There was an old person of Sheen whose expression was calm and serene. He sat in the water and drank bottled porter, the placid old person of Sheen. There was an old person of Shields by Edward Lear. There was an old person of Shields who frequented the valleys and fields. All the mice and the cats and the snakes and the rats followed after the person of Shields. There was an old person of Shoreham by Edward Lear. There was an old person of Shoreham whose habits were marked by decorum. He bought an umbrella and sat in the cellar, which pleased all the people of Shoreham. There was an old person of Skye by Edward Lear. There was an old person of Skye who waltzed with a blue bottle fly, who buzzed a sweet tune to the light of the moon, and entranced all the people of Skye. There was an old person of Slaw by Edward Lear. There was an old person of Slaw who danced at the end of a ball, but they said, "If you sneeze, you might damage the trees, you imprudent old person of Slaw."
87. There was an old person of Spain. There was an old person of Spain who hated all trouble and pain. So he sat on a chair with his feet in the air. But I'm Barbara's old person of Spain. 101. There was an old person of Sparta. There was an old person of Sparta who had 25 sons and 1 daughter. He fed them on snails and weighed them in scales. What a wonderful person of Sparta.
There was an old person of Stroud by Edward Lear. There was an old person of Stroud who was horribly jammed in a crowd. Some she slew with a kick, some she scrunched with a stick, that impulsive old person of Stroud.
93. There was an old person of Tartary. There was an old person of Tartary who divided his jugular artery. But he scratched to his wife, and she said, "All my life your death will be felt by all Tartary."
There was an old man of Thames Ditton by Edward Lear. There was an old man of Thames Ditton called out for something to sit on. But they brought him a hat and said, "Sit upon that, you brutious old man of Thames Ditton."
64. There was an old person of Tring. There was an old person of Tring who embellished his nose with a ring. He gazed at the moon every evening in June, that ecstatic old man of Tring. 61. There was an old person of Troy. There was an old person of Troy whose drink was warm brandy and salt, which he took with a spoon by the light of a moon in sight of the city of Troy.
There was an old person of Ware by Edward Lear. There was an old person of Ware who rode on the back of a bier. When they asked, "Does it trot?" he said, "Certainly not. He's a mopsicon flopsicon beer." There was an old person of Wick by Edward Lear. There was an old person of Wick who said, "Tick-a-tick, tick-a-tick, chick-a-bee, chick-a-boo," and he said nothing more. The laconic old person of Wick.
32. There was an old person whose habits. There was an old person whose habits induced him to feed upon rabbits. When he'd eaten 18, he turned perfectly green, upon which he relinquished those habits.